Look at your hand for a second, not in a mystical way. Just the plain machine of it. Skin, knuckles, fingerprints, little blood vessels under the surface, maybe a phone resting against your palm like the most modern object your ancestors never saw coming. If your ancestry runs outside Africa, a small part of that hand almost certainly carries DNA from a vanished kind of human. If your ancestry runs through parts of Oceania or some groups in Southeast Asia, another vanished human lineage may be in the story too. And if your ancestry is mostly African, the honest version is not none, because later back migration can leave lower traces there as well. Human history is allergic to clean boxes. That is the first crack in the old picture. For a long time, we told human origins like a victory march. Homo sapiens appeared, left Africa, met the rough old cousins, won the planet, and everyone else became skulls behind glass. Nice story, very tidy. Suspiciously tidy, like a family reunion where every scandal has been edited out of the photo album. Then ancient DNA walked in and ruined the seating chart. The Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, the work associated with Svante Pääbo, and public summaries from the Smithsonian Human Origins program all point to the same basic shock. Many living people inherited DNA from Neanderthals. Not vibes. Not I like caves, therefore I am ancient. Actual sequences in the genome compared letter by letter with DNA recovered from Neanderthal bones. A museum bone became a comparison file. A dead cousin became data you could line up against a living mouth swab. That is the strange power of ancient DNA. It does not resurrect the person, but it lets the person contradict our neat story. The term scientists use is introgression. It sounds like a machine in a basement, but the meaning is simple. Genes from one population enter another population through interbreeding. Translation, with all the drama removed. Two groups meet, some people have children, some of those children survive, and the biological receipt gets copied into the future. This is where the question stops being a naughty headline and becomes a problem for the word human. If Neanderthals were a different species, why do billions of living people carry their genes? If Denisovans were another ancient human lineage, why does their DNA still appear in people today? And if the borders between these groups were real but not sealed, what exactly are we? Because species sounds firmer than it behaves. In school, the rule often arrives as a door with a lock. Different species cannot have fertile offspring. Horses and donkeys make mules. Mules usually cannot keep the line going. Lesson finished. Close the textbook. Evolution is less polite. Populations can split for hundreds of thousands of years, change in different climates, adapt to different diets, diseases, bodies, faces, and social worlds, yet still remain close enough that when they meet again, genes can cross the border. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were not the same group wearing different jackets. Their lineages had been apart for an immense stretch of time, with estimates for their shared ancestry reaching back roughly 400,000 to 700,000 years. That is not a neighbor you forgot to call. That is deep family separation. Deep enough for real anatomical and genetic differences. Not so deep that reproduction became impossible. So the old family tree begins to blur. A tree is clean. One trunk, branches splitting, dead branches ending. The genome looks more like river water after rain. Streams separate, run through different ground, then sometimes meet and carry each other forward. Some lineages vanished as separate peoples. Some pieces of them did not. Keep the emotional boundary clean, though. DNA cannot tell us whether any particular encounter was tenderness, alliance, coercion, ordinary life, or something we have no language for. The genome does not preserve glances. It preserves inheritance. The children happened. The descendants happened. The feelings are behind a locked door. And that is enough. Because the next layer of the question comes with numbers small enough to dismiss and large enough to rewrite the story. 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in many people of non-African ancestry. Several percent Denisovan DNA in some populations in Oceania and Southeast Asia. A few percent sounds tiny until you remember that a genome is not a pizza, and 2% of the instruction manual of a living body is not a crumb. So look at your hand again. The mystery is not whether ancient humans were like us in some poetic museum way. The mystery is why the line between us and them was leaky enough for their DNA to reach the present, and whether one small percentage can prove that the human family was never pure in the first place. The first number is almost rude in how small it looks, 1 to 4%, often around 2% in many people whose ancestry lies outside Africa. If a restaurant served you 2% of dinner, you would not admire the precision. You would ask whether the chef had been attacked by accounting software. But DNA does not work like a dinner plate. 2% of a genome means millions of letters, scattered in pieces, carried through births, illnesses, migrations, marriages, and ordinary people who never knew their bodies were forwarding mail from the Pleistocene. The basic evidence is not a campfire story. It comes from sequencing ancient DNA and comparing it with modern genomes. Researchers built reference genomes from Neanderthal remains, then asked whether living people share long patterns with them in ways that make sense only if interbreeding happened after Homo sapiens left Africa. The answer was yes, not uniformly, not in every person at the same level. but broadly enough that the Smithsonian can summarize it for a public audience. Neanderthals contribute up to about 1 to 4% of the genomes of many non-African modern humans. The careful wording matters. Non-African is a useful broad label, not a moral category and not a clean wall. Neanderthals are not known from African fossils, so the main mixing signal fits a meeting outside Africa, likely in Eurasia or near the roots out of Africa. But later movements of people carried some Neanderthal ancestry back into African populations at lower levels. So the honest sentence is not Africans have none. The honest sentence is the strongest signal is mostly in non-African populations, with lower traces possible elsewhere. That may sound like a footnote, but it is actually the difference between science and a meme wearing a lab coat. Then the Denisovan evidence makes the picture even less tidy. Neanderthals left enough bones to become familiar. Heavy brow, stocky build, museum reconstructions, the ancient cousin with a branding problem. Denisovans did not give science that luxury. They entered the story from Denisova cave through astonishingly little fossil material. A finger bone, teeth, fragments, later other pieces from Asia. A species, or at least a deeply distinct archaic human lineage, known mostly from DNA. That is like identifying a missing city because one brick still has the street map written inside it. When researchers read that DNA, they saw it was not Neanderthal and not modern human. It was another branch of the human family. Then they found its living shadow. Some Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian groups and some Philippine groups carried Denisovan ancestry at several percent levels, with high estimates often discussed around the 4 to 6% range. Not every individual, not every group equally. But enough to make the point unavoidable. A human lineage known from scraps of bone has a measurable legacy in living people. There is a strange dignity in that. The fossil record can lose almost your entire body, and the genome can still say, wait, this population mattered. Now the central question tightens. If this were only Neanderthal DNA, someone could try to shrink the story into one unusual contact zone. Homo sapiens met one cousin, there was some mixing, end of scandal. Denisovan ancestry makes that too small. It shows that the late human world contained more than one kind of not quite us, not entirely other, and that Homo sapiens were not moving through an empty stage. They were entering landscapes where other humans had already been living, adapting, failing, surviving, and leaving genetic possibilities behind. Picture the genome like a copied book. Most pages come from recent ancestors, people close enough in time to have names, languages, villages, documents, maybe photographs if you are lucky. But in the margins are passages from lineages that had been separate for hundreds of thousands of years. No one today is a neat half-Neanderthal cartoon. No one wakes up and thinks, sorry, my Denisovan side wants breakfast. The inheritance is broken into small fragments, but small fragments can still prove contact. And contact is the polite word for the biological fact. Children happened. The percentages do not tell us the emotions, the social setting, or the exact number of encounters. Those are active scientific questions, and some possible ghost archaic populations may still be visible only through genetic shadows. But the percentages do tell us that the old wall between human and other human had doors in it. The next question is whether the whole case depends only on statistics, because percentages can feel abstract. A viewer can hear 2% and think, fine, ancient math. Impressive, but cold. Is there one body, one person, one physical piece of evidence that makes the mixing impossible to wave away? There is. And she makes the family tree look like it needs a therapist. The person at the center of the next clue is known as Denny. That was not her real name, obviously. The deep past is not considerate enough to label its children for future geneticists. Denny is the nickname for Denisova 11, a small bone fragment from Denisova cave that became one of the clearest answers ever found to the question of whether different ancient human lineages had children together. In 2018, a Nature paper by Vivian Sloan and colleagues reported the result. Denny was a first-generation hybrid. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan. Not one ancestor somewhere far back, not a faint signal after 1,000 generations. First generation. One parent from one archaic human lineage, one parent from another. If the percentages from living people are the smoke, Denny is the room where the match was struck. The reason scientists could say this is not magic, it is inheritance doing its ordinary work. A child receives DNA from both parents. When researchers examined the DNA from that bone fragment, it carried the pattern expected from a person whose two parents came from two different archaic groups. Her genome stood right on the border, not as a symbol, as biology. This matters because it breaks the easy escape route. You could hear about Neanderthal DNA in modern people and say, maybe the statistics are being overread. You could hear about Denisovan ancestry and say maybe the fossil record is too thin. Denny makes that dodge much harder. She is a physical individual from the ancient world, carrying two vanished lineages in one body. And she was not even Homo sapiens. That is the part that widens the story. We often frame ancient interbreeding as us meeting them. But Denny shows that the archaic humans were mixing with each other too. Neanderthals and Denisovans were not museum categories standing on separate shelves, waiting for modern humans to arrive and explain the plot. They had their own histories, their own movements, their own overlapping zones. One hybrid child would be amazing by itself. But the larger genetic record suggests interbreeding was not a single lightning strike. It happened in more than one place, more than one period, and probably under different social circumstances we cannot reconstruct. Older estimates placed a major Neanderthal contribution to the ancestors of present-day non-Africans roughly 47,000 to 65,000 years ago. More recent ancient genome work in Nature and Science has narrowed the main shared pulse for many living non-Africans to around the 45 to 50,000 year range, with the process likely unfolding across generations rather than one mythic night near a cave entrance. That update makes the story sharper, not weaker. It says the signal is not vague folklore from the genome. It can be dated, tested, refined, argued over, and improved as new ancient DNA appears. Science is not a statue. It is a repair shop with better tools every decade. The exact number of encounters remains an active question. Some models suggest repeated contact. Some signals may point toward unknown ghost populations that have not yet given us enough fossils to name with confidence. That uncertainty should not be hidden because it is part of the power of the field. Ancient DNA can sometimes see a population before archaeology can put a face on it. It is like hearing footsteps in the dark before the person enters the room. But the established direction is firm. The late Pleistocene was a web, not a ladder. Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other archaic groups were not arranged in a neat moral ranking from primitive to modern. They were lineages with deep separations, local adaptations, and occasional genetic bridges. The bridges did not need to be common to matter. A few children at the edge of a range can become a signal if their descendants survive. A small group can carry a fragment into a larger population. A helpful variant can spread. A harmful one can fade. A neutral one can drift like a loose thread in a coat. Over tens of thousands of years, the genome remembers what the landscape erased. The emotional temptation is obvious. Denny's parents were two different ancient human lineages, which makes modern dating apps look embarrassingly narrow. But the honest line remains the same. The DNA proves parentage, not romance. It cannot tell us whether the encounter involved tenderness, alliance, force, ordinary social life, or something outside our categories. We are not reading a diary, we are reading inheritance. And inheritance is enough to disturb the old story. Denny shows that the borders were crossable. Modern genomes show that some crossings reached us. Newer studies keep refining when and how those crossings happened. The question now changes again. If those inherited fragments survived all the way into living people, did they just sit there like ancient dust in the genetic attic? Or were some of them kept because they helped bodies survive places, diseases, sunlight, cold, hunger, and thin mountain air? Old DNA does not get a free retirement plan. A genome is not a museum that preserves every ancestor because the lighting is nice. It is a crowded instruction system under pressure from survival, reproduction, chance, and time. Variants that cause problems can be reduced by natural selection. Variants that do little may drift quietly. Variants that help, even in a small way, can be copied again and again until a vanished lineage is no longer only a vanished lineage. It becomes a set of useful possibilities. That does not mean every archaic fragment in a modern person is a superpower. This is where a lot of internet caveman content trips over its own club. There is no single Neanderthal gene for being tough, moody, hairy, loyal, aggressive, introverted, or weirdly good at grilling meat. Most traits are controlled by many genes and by environment, development, diet, disease, and chance. A variant is not a button. It is one voice in a loud room. Still, some archaic variants are not silent. Studies of Neanderthal and Denisovan introgression have linked inherited archaic DNA with parts of immune response, skin and hair biology, metabolism, and sleep timing. Careful language matters. Linked with, associated with, able to influence. Not, this gene makes you this way. The American Journal of Human Genetics, for example, has reported associations between Neanderthal variants and traits including skin tone, hair color, and sleeping patterns in present-day Europeans. Max Planck's summaries of work on toll-like receptor genes describe archaic variants involved in immune recognition, the system that helps cells notice bacteria, fungi, and parasites before your body has time to write a formal complaint. That is a good place for the joke, because the joke rides the fact. Neanderthals did not fully move into your immune system like tiny prehistoric tenants paying rent in bone marrow. But in some people, inherited archaic variants can help tune parts of immune response. Close enough to be funny, not so close that a geneticist throws a chair. Much surviving Neanderthal DNA is also non-coding. That phrase sounds like junk, but that is not what it means. Non-coding regions do not directly provide recipes for proteins in the simple textbook way. They can affect timing, regulation, and context. When a gene is active, how strongly, in which tissue, under what conditions. Less like a brick in a wall, more like the dimmer switch deciding how bright the room gets. And the genome shows evidence of cleanup. Harmful archaic variants were gradually selected against. Some regions of the modern human genome are poor in Neanderthal ancestry, suggesting those inherited pieces did not play well in the new genetic background. Evolution was not sentimental. If a fragment caused enough trouble, it tended to lose the argument. Even after that, a surprising amount remains, not in one person, but scattered across many. Any one individual of non-African ancestry may carry only a small slice, often around 1 to a few percent. Yet studies reconstructing Neanderthal segments from modern genomes have estimated that around 20% of the Neanderthal genome survives somewhere across living people. One stranger has one torn page, another has a paragraph, someone else has a sentence. No one has the full book, but the book was not burned completely. The Denisovan example that cuts through the fog is EPAS1 in Tibetans. High altitude is not a motivational poster, it is a biological problem. Thin air means less oxygen and bodies have to respond without creating new problems. A famous nature study found that a version of EPAS1 associated with Tibetan high-altitude adaptation likely came from Denisovan-like DNA, not from a full Denisovan skeleton standing helpfully on the Tibetan plateau, but from genetic inheritance passed through ancient populations before it became useful in a place where breathing itself becomes a test. That is the reversal. The extinct cousin is not only a skull, a tooth, a fragment, or a reconstructed face under museum light. Sometimes the legacy is a working adjustment in a living body. Sometimes the fossil record is quiet while the genome keeps talking. Again, the field is still being refined. The strength of an association can change with better samples. Denisovan ancestry is still harder to map than Neanderthal ancestry because the fossil record is thinner and the known Denisovan genome comes from a limited ancient context. Possible ghost populations remain active science, not a final chapter. But the main point is now stronger because it is narrower. Some archaic variants survived not merely as decoration, but because biology had reasons to keep them. So what does that make you if your body carries any of these fragments? Not a caveman. Not a hybrid monster, not a purity test with a brow ridge. More like a walking archive with edits. Pages removed, pages kept, some pages still giving instructions. If that changes how you think about being human, put it in the comments. Does it make us feel less special or more astonishing? And subscribe, because the deeper we follow the body, the less it looks like a clean invention, and the more it looks like an argument that survived. But one question is still waiting. If a lineage disappears from the landscape but remains in the genomes of living people, did it simply go extinct, or did part of it change address? So maybe extinction is not the first word to trust. It is not wrong. Neanderthals are not walking through Europe today as a separate people. Denisovans are not leaving fresh footprints across Asia, waiting for a graduate student to find them beside a coffee cup and a panic attack. Their lineages vanished as independent populations. Their languages, if they had them, are gone. Their jokes are gone. The way a Neanderthal child learned a face, the way a Denisovan family understood a storm, the ordinary texture of their lives, gone. But biology has a talent for making simple words uncomfortable. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals shared a last common ancestor roughly 400,000 to 700,000 years ago. That is an enormous separation. Long enough for bodies to diverge, for faces and skeletons and immune systems to follow different paths, for scientists to treat them as separate species, or, at minimum, deeply distinct archaic human lineages. Denisovans add another branch to that old separation. And still, close enough. Close enough for children. Close enough for some of those children to grow and have descendants. Close enough that a fragment from one population could enter another, survive selection, cross continents, and arrive in a person scrolling under electric light. That is what species boundaries can look like when you see them up close. Not imaginary, but not always iron. The classroom definition wants a clean lock. If two groups can have fertile offspring, same species. If they cannot, different species. Nature keeps refusing to fill out the form properly. Real evolution works through populations that separate gradually, meet occasionally, exchange genes rarely or repeatedly, and then separate again. The border can be real and porous at the same time, like a fence with weather damage, like a coastline. Like a family rule, everyone pretends was never broken. This is why the purity story collapses. Not because differences were fake. Neanderthals were not just funny-looking us. Denisovans were not a rumor with molars. These were real human lineages with their own histories. But the old idea that Homo sapiens won by staying separate is not what the DNA says. You are almost certainly part something else if your ancestry carries these ancient traces. For most of history, we imagined humans as a single, pure lineage that won. The DNA says the opposite. When Homo sapiens spread out of Africa, we met other kinds of humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, maybe more, and we had children with them. Those unions were not a footnote. They left 1 to several % of many people's genomes as archaic DNA, with some variants still associated with immunity, skin and hair biology, sleep timing, metabolism, and altitude tolerance today. The other humans did not just go extinct in the clean way the museum label suggests. Part of them survived by being absorbed into us. Your body can be a living archive of vanished lineages, the last chapter of a love and survival story between human worlds that no longer exist as separate peoples. Love and survival story, with an asterisk. The survival part is genetic fact. The love part is human interpretation. The DNA proves children and descendants. It does not prove candlelight, consent, affection, fear, alliance, or violence in any specific encounter. We owe the past that honesty. Turning every ancient birth into romance would be as false as turning every ancient human into a brute. But even with the asterisk, the result is enormous. The caveman is not only a punchline with a club. For many people, the caveman is a family matter, though that sentence should probably not be your opening move at dinner unless you enjoy explaining introgression while everyone else is trying to pass the bread. Look at the present tense version of the story. Your body is doing ordinary things right now. Immune cells patrol, skin responds to light, sleep rhythms pull you toward morning or night. Blood chemistry negotiates oxygen. Most of that is modern human biology, built by many ancestors across many places. But in some of those systems, for some people, old archaic variants still sit in the conversation. Not shouting, not ruling, present. That is the mirror. The ancient is not only behind you, it is participating in you. A museum can make vanished humans feel safely distant. A skull in a case, a jaw under a label, a reconstruction staring past the gift shop. But the genome makes the glass thinner. The person looking at the fossil may carry a small inheritance from the world the fossil came from. The extinct cousin is not only the figure behind the glass. In pieces, in fragments, in old instructions still being tested by living bodies, some of him may be the person looking through it. So, do not picture human origins as a clean victory parade with Homo sapiens marching alone at the end. Picture a borderland, different human faces, different histories, a meeting no one wrote down. A child born where categories fail. Most of that world disappears, tens of thousands of years pass. Then you lift your hand in the blue light of a screen, and the border is still there, hidden in the cells that make you ordinary. If this changes the way you think about being human, say where it lands. Less special, more connected, more strange, more alive? And subscribe for more stories where the body turns out not to be a finished machine, but an archive that occasionally tells on itself.